it, you can't manage it. And then I sat there and I went, well, in this day and age, I work in an industry, public relations, people say, you can't measure it, John. You say, of course you can. You just got to invest in a methodology. You've got to have objectives. Corporate social responsibility, as I understand it, is exactly the same. There's no point in embarking unless you can actually measure the outputs. And outputs, like all good objectives, need to be smart, specific, measurable, attainable, relevant and time-bound. And if we apply smart objectives, then there's nothing that we cannot achieve and report back on that. Now, each and every one of our panellist members are experts when it comes to not just corporate social responsibility, but particularly the ability to quantify outputs and report back to others within the organisation. Dr. Simon Longstaff is the Executive Director of the St James Ethics Centre. Many of you will know the Corporate Social Responsibility Index, and he will talk about that in a second. Each of our panellists I will ask to speak for about 5 to 7 minutes and then open us up to as much discussion as we've got up until the afternoon tea break. Eric Dindy is the Director of Marketing and Corporate Affairs at Mission Australia. Mission Australia is working on developing and reporting indices for the non-for-profit sector. Clearly there are differences between corporates and non-for-profits when it comes to reporting. Lord Michael Hastings, as you know, Head of CSR for BBC, Chair of Crime Concern and an independent peer in the House of Lords, will discuss how the BBC has gone about ensuring reporting of its corporate social responsibility activities is becoming embedded within the organisation and its program. And Eva Cox, who, as you know, Senior Lecturer at UTS in the Faculty of Humanities and Social Sciences, will share her thoughts on the importance of measuring the culture of an organisation. So I'm going to ask them to come to the stage now individually. I'm going to start with Dr. Longstaff. Actually, I'm going to get you to do those there, but I am going to ask Eric to come up because Eric's got a few slides to go through. And I think if those mics are on, we're away with the panel.
Well, thank you for that. I have to declare that I'm actually not an expert in quantifying things, so I hope I haven't misrepresented myself. I'm just a poor old philosopher, and what we're able to do best, I suppose, is to generate questions which create work for our mates over hundreds of years, so we dare never answer them. So if you go away with a few extra questions, that is partly a product of my background. But today I want to talk a little bit about something of a journey that we took in relation to an instrument which has been operating in Australia now for about 3 years called the Corporate Responsibility Index, and why at the Ethics Centre we decided to take on the role of trustee for that process in Australia. That's the first point I should make, is that as an Ethics Centre we do not actually measure any organisation ourselves. There is a process which we support which has been developed initially in the United Kingdom, and we're in Australia to try and ensure that it is true to the purpose for which it's been established. But to the journey, about 5 years ago, there was an initial attempt made in Australia not to measure actual performance, but rather to measure the reputation of companies. And it had various labels over its time, but in the course of it being employed, it created a good deal of concern within the business community and progressively amongst NGOs. And it meant that what had originally been published by the Sydney Morning Herald and The Age as a joint operation fell away, which meant that we were left in Australia after a worthy start with no published instrument which could provide the community and other interested stakeholders with information about how companies were actually performing in this area. And we were approached by the Herald and The Age at the time to see whether or not we had any better ideas about how it would be done, largely because we'd been somewhat critical of the past instrument. And it so happened that only a month or so before that, I'd been in the United Kingdom attending the 20th anniversary celebrations for an organisation called Business in the Community. It was an organisation, it's quite large now, it's about 400 employees, it's got around 700 or 800, I think, of Britain's major listed companies as its members. But it had come into existence as a result of 2 business leaders responding to riots in the inner cities of some of the inner cities of Britain, and recognising that whether you looked at it through the lens of enlightened self-interest or through the lens of social responsibility, for business to be indifferent to the plight of people in those circumstances was both imprudent and unconscionable. And so they brought into existence an organisation led by business which was committed to addressing the broader issues of responsibility that fell on business outside just any formal obligation that governments might impose. And they've done lots of things, and it's another story for another time about the innovative ways in which they've tried to address some of Britain's most unyielding problems. But one of the things they did was they'd established an environmental index, and about 3.5 to 4 years ago, businesses decided that they wanted to actually expand its remit because it was a highly respected instrument in the UK. Not just to look at environmental dimensions, but also to have a much broader focus on corporate responsibility as a whole. And there were to be 4 areas that they would want to measure. They wanted to measure impact in relation to the marketplace, so how you sold the things you had, your conduct as a business there, your performance in relation to your workplace, in terms of the natural environment and in terms of the community. So those were the 4 areas. Now, that sounds like a kind of a bit of an also-run kind of story, and it could have been true of many initiatives in the past. But what I was really struck by in this particular story was that rather than starting with asking the question, how is it that we can develop an instrument which is useful to report to third parties, our stakeholders, which might have been one way to ask the question, a group of 80 British businesses came together, and they had people like John Elkington and others helping them to develop this instrument. They said, instead, the question we want to ask is, how do we measure our performance and report on it so that we can actually improve what we do ourselves? That's the primary question. How do we get information which helps us to improve our performance, and therefore has the same degree of rigour that we would expect in other tools that we rely upon as senior managers or boards in actually to guide the improvement of performance? The analogy here is to do pretty much with the way in which financial accounts developed, in the sense that rather than them evolving with a principal purpose being to provide information to third parties like shareholders, their origin starts in how do we get better information to manage the business? How do we get better financial information at this point? Now, the CRI has been mapped against the Global Reporting Initiative. It's available in Australia on a voluntary basis. The take-up has been very slow here, and the principal reasons being given for why it's been slow are firstly that it takes a lot of effort to complete such a searching instrument as this in its first year, and then it's also subject to external validation because we want it to be as robust as possible. But the other thing that I've heard, and where I'll probably round off, is that sometimes it's been said to me by business, oh, well, we don't need to measure it, we just need to get on and do it. And I consider that to be a kind of a very silly response. It would be no more the case that a business would say we don't need to keep financial accounts, we just need to get on with the business. Then they could possibly say with any justification that important issues involving society and the natural world more generally ought not to be subject to proper evaluation and reporting. And that's where we think we've got with the CRI, but I'm interested to hear what others have to say on the topic as well.
Thank you very much. Eric, all yours on non-for-profit.
Thank you. Now, in 2003, when Sharon Jackson came to Australia, I had this incredible meeting with her. And you know, there was a rare meeting where your mind, your heart, and dare I say your soul connect around a topic. And the outcome was quite outstanding. Within 30 minutes, Sharon had convinced me on the CSR cause. It took her another 30 minutes to get me to enroll on the CSR summit, which she was running, or retreat, which she was running in Tasmania, which I met David Grayson. And another 30 minutes to ask me to come to London so that I could meet some of the key players in that field. So what I'd like to share with you today is our journey into CSR from a non-for-profit and from Mission Australia perspective. In Tasmania, Sharon said to me, look, what are you going to do about Mission Australia and sustainability? And I said, well, you know, what do you mean, Sharon? We are, you know, working in the field every day, helping people. And she said, well, what about the other side of sustainability? So I went back to our headquarters and I said to our CEO, look, I think we need to look at sustainability and walk the talk. We can't be going to corporation and ask them about their corporate social responsibility platform and not doing it ourselves. So I went back to Sharon and I said, look, I think you can help us. And Sharon very generously gave about a year of her time coming back in and out of London to help us to set what I call our Mission Australia Sustainability Project, which got 7 specific steps. And I'm not going to report on all those steps, but I can tell you that today we are about, we're pretty much on the fifth step. So what I'd like to do in 5 minutes is to briefly talk to you about some of those steps. I mean, the first key issue for us was to look at our drivers. And as you can see, they're not so different from what you've been hearing for the last 2 days in terms of the corporate drivers, except for probably from building spiritual capital, which really mean for us to look at, you know, meaningful workplace, or allowing our staff to engage in spiritual practices, and of course our advocacy platform, which is terribly important for us. But apart from that, employee motivation, innovation will transform into social innovation. I had a discussion with Michael on that yesterday, you know, because we're in the strange business to actually letting go of our clients, because we're looking at ways that we can provide solution and long-term solution for them. And so it is a difficult business proposition when you have, you know, a data bank of clients and months after months they're exiting your data bank. But for us, it's the only sustainable result that we want to see in the long term. Of course, for us, it's about building our brand, it's about building income stream, it's looking at our relationship with our suppliers, it's looking at our risk management and governance. Now, I'm going to be talking to you tomorrow in great depth about all those different drivers. So today I'll share just 3 specific ones. This journey has been quite exciting for us because it's taken us to the heart of our corporation. And we looked particularly at our MA leadership model. You know, what is it that we want to do with our staff? You know, how do we want to attract and retain the best talent in this organization? How do we walk the talk in terms of, you know, spelling out our values and allowing our employees to live their values? And when do we make the hard decision to say to one of our employees, you've met all your KPIs in terms of your performance, but you're not doing it with the values of the organization. So next year you won't be working for us. Because I think this is what is critical in terms of, you know, if you want to live your values and building and spending money and energy building a performance culture based on specific values, you've got to have some way to measure how people actually are matching their behaviors with their values. We've used Richard Barrett systems, which I'm sure Eva is aware of, to look at monitoring across our organization, the personal values of our employees, looking at the values of our organization, and finding that, you know, there is a mismatch. Finding that, you know, some of our employees were saying to us, look, we would like your values to be, your corporate values to be a bit higher. So then we worked with a numbers of organizations, including McKinsey, and we've set up some pretty interesting workshops looking at emotional intelligence and spiritual intelligence, which is one of the latest waves coming from the UK, to really look at changing the culture and the performance culture in our organization. We looked at our brand, and you know, what does it mean to have a brand that talks about sustainable results? What does it mean for a charity to have a brand which talks about result, outcomes, and good stories, not about problems, and constantly going to the marketplace with, we can't cope, please give us some money. So we took the bold step to really change our brand positioning and develop a campaign that is celebrating our heroes, which is our clients. And I think that's been one of the most probably bold steps that we've done in terms of brand management and communication in the last 3 years. Of course, we had to convince the board. So we went back to the board with a business case. And what is quite interesting for us is that we are now looking at the next business plan or corporate plan, and what we're sort of saying to our board and to our CEO, well, why don't we just actually put sustainability as a central theme of our corporate planning? Because it is the one that gives us the most meaning. And of course, it's fundamental to our mission and vision. And if it's about efficiency and running our services better and saving money, then of course we can spend more in the community. And it's mostly about empowering our staff. And I can tell you that Generation Y is looking for organizations that walk the talk. Organizations that can provide them with experiential learning, with community access, with spiritual practices. And so we are facing with a challenge to actually put that in place within Mission Australia. And at the end of the day, it's for us, it's a way to demonstrate our leadership in our industry. So where are we up to? as I said at the beginning, I think we've basically articulated the business case. We've got the board on board. We are looking now at the hard step, which is, using the CR index and adapting it to the NGO sector, looking at benchmarking, reporting, stakeholder engagement, and eventually measuring and reporting. Now, that will take us another 6 to 12 months, but we have set the challenge that by June 2006, we'll have our first sustainability report published in Australia. So I can't thank Sharon enough for what she's done for us. And I think for many organisations in Australia, I think it's been an extraordinary journey. And it's one that never finished. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Lord Hastings.
Thank you and good afternoon. I'm going to probably offer a slightly discordant note, if that's all right, about measurement and reporting. And I say that with the eagle eye of David Grayson looking on me, about business in the community's measurement model. I spent a little time last night completing a bit of the BITC index, which of course I was phoning back to my deputy who was filling in the paperwork yesterday, and it's all been submitted today. And we'll see where we go. This year in the BBC's own corporate responsibility report, we've reported on our targets on waste and CO2 emissions and transport and recycling and so on. But the challenge I want to suggest to you is that what the KPI model increasingly does is it looks at only those things which are tangible in organizational conduct, and it doesn't deal with that most intangible aspect of corporate social responsibility, which is essentially about ethical leadership. And I'm yet to find any way in which you can, other than instinctively recognize, that you can tangibly measure that. You know it when you see it, you utterly value it, and you desperately want it. But can you put it into a framework by which you can assess it against others who have it or don't? I was reading an article over breakfast this morning in the Financial Times, which is the Asian edition of the Financial Times for today, December the 1st. And this is an article about William Madonna, who's the outgoing chairman of the American watchdog set up to police the Sarbanes-Oxley Act. It's a very interesting piece. If you don't see the Financial Times, it's around in the restaurant downstairs. You could certainly go and grab one and have a look. And he's standing down from the role after 2.5 years, responsible for essentially policing the new regulatory system in the USA. And this is a comment he makes just at the end of towards the end of the article. He remains frustrated at the disconnection between the levels of executive pay and the performance of some chief executives, and warns of the risk that the public will demand legislation to solve the problem. The American people are demonstrably still very unhappy about the level of executive compensation, he says. The one thing they do not understand is paying for failure. Now, I say that because David was tackled yesterday in the session he led in the morning about why one particular leading business had left business in the community in the UK, why Simon Longstaff, chairman of Adnams, had stepped out of the organisation, and did so because of his personal disgust with the remuneration paid to what one might see as a failing chief executive of a large corporate in the United Kingdom, and why that hadn't become an issue of essentially the challenge to leadership. Exactly the same issue is what's picked out in the Financial Times today, is that this area of executive leadership, particularly CEO leadership, is beyond the pale of any measurement structure. But actually it is the thing which determines the entire culture and the embedding of everything to do with values and social responsibility. So I'm not convinced that the measurement models that are currently available achieve that most critical of nexus and deliver really against the hard issue, which is how do you get leadership to own, love, treasure, value, and deliver social value as well as financial value at the same time, and to own it as of equal merit. And therefore I want to suggest that we need to scrap the existing measurement models and start again with a rounded eye.
Okay. Thanks, Eva.
After that last blurb about how you presented, I thought I'd better come up here and sort of wave the bits around. Thank you, Michael, for raising an issue that I want to raise. Yes, I'm a social scientist. Yes, I know how to measure. I also teach my students in my research classes, if you want to know the answers, use qualitative methods. If you want to keep politicians or boards of management happy, use quantitative methods. It doesn't give you the answers, but it reassures people because you can percentage things. So I think we get back to the question that I think Michael raised. And I mean, one of the things I'm down here to sort of talk about, and I want to add in a couple of others if I can in my time frame, is the fact that I think what's actually really important is measuring the cultures of organisations, because you can shove around with leadership and you can move individuals in and you can restructure and you can do all of those things. But basically, if you have a culture which lacks trust, which doesn't believe the place acts fairly, which assumes that people are out to get you, which assumes that if you raise an issue that you become the problem, it doesn't matter what you do, you're not going to be able to achieve an ethical organisation, an organisation that acts ethically. And that's what we're really on about in this case. I've got a very loose definition of an ethical organisation, which is one that makes the best decisions possible on the best information they have available, taking into account the needs of their stakeholders and framing it within the objects of the organisation. So it's fairly loose, fairly broad, and it doesn't actually sit down and write a code of ethics. Don't like codes of ethics because it means if it's not in the code of ethics, you can do it. What you want in an organisation is a culture of ethical decision-making, and what I've been doing, playing around with for some time, and I forgot to bring it in with me, but I'm interested if anybody wants to play with it, is I've got a 2-page questionnaire, which is a whole set of statements which people can agree and disagree with, which gives them some sense, when we've tried it out, on whether you actually have people in your organisation that think you're doing the right thing. And I developed this when I was working with the Body Shop, and I was really impressed about the fact that in the first round, 82% of the people said they were proud to tell people they worked for the Body Shop. And in the second round, after a change of management and all sorts of dramas, it went up to 93%. I thought there's something about resilient trust cultures which are really actually important to creating in things like that. If anybody wants to talk to me about it, please make contact. I'm really happy to distribute this around in a most uncommercial way. I just want people to start thinking about the cultures of organisations, because otherwise we're going to stuff it. Because basically, if you ain't got the culture, it's not going to work, regardless of who you've got in the CEO's position. I just want to very briefly pick up on a couple of other points. Quite frankly, Eric's stuff gave me a shiver down the back of my spine. Because it's an assumption that what you have to do with NGOs is make them look like corporates. And I think that that's the wrong way to go. I'd also like to throw a question to Eric, is if Mission Australia wants to put itself up as having corporate values, is it going to take on further employment programs under a situation where the government's going to demand you act unethically? I think this is a major question that a whole lot of NGOs are going to have to think about. I think it's actually, I would say, that an organisation like Mission Australia with a high employment programs has got some very real ethical dilemmas if it's really going to talk about corporate social responsibility, given some of the changes in policies that are going on now. Which gets me back to the fact that I think it's trying to act as an ethical, in a way that is ethical according to your values and your aims and your brand, if you want to use it, and those things there that really counts. That's why earlier in the questions I raised, I said corporate donations are not corporate social responsibility. Lynette confirmed that, I think, in what she was saying about IAG. If it connects with your primary purpose, fine. If it doesn't, it's about making sure that your employees are happy with working for you. It's employee sort of conditions, training, whatever you want to call it. If you're doing it in order to get good pictures in the paper and look good, it's part of your marketing. I've got no problems about organisations doing it. Don't tell me it's philanthropy, and don't tell me it's corporate social responsibility, because I'm sorry, it is neither. It is actually part of your core, unless it is part of your sort of core activities. It is part of your employment standards or whatever it is. Yes, it becomes a subset of that, but I don't think it's a pillar, and I do strongly disagree. And I think if people go down that, I'm tired of people telling me, and I had a conversation with Lend-Lease recently, that social responsibility is about donations and being nice to children around the area or something of that sort. So can we start talking about organisations that have ethical cultures? Can we start talking about what an ethical culture means in the broadest sense? And also, given the fact there's a lot of NGOs here, can the NGOs stop regarding this area as a way of milking the corporate sector and please start looking at its own ethical frameworks? I'm tired of the fact that I can talk about ethics with the private sector. I can't talk about ethics with the government sector. They don't know what it means anymore. And I certainly can't talk about ethics in the NGO sector. I tried it at the ACOS Congress and they all say, but we are ethical because we're doing good. And I'm saying, sorry, that is not the definition of being corporately socially responsible. So I think it's time that the NGO sector started looking at itself, because then it can actually maybe exploit, if you want to use economic terms, its competitive advantage, because at least some of them ought to end up as having maybe a higher score in some of these areas than the businesses, and if they don't, they ought to be ashamed of themselves because they're losing out on what they should be doing for their constituency. Thank you.
Go get them, Eva. And I guess the first question, I'm going to ask Eric to respond, and then I'm going to ask the road.
There's about 10 questions, and I was thinking, Eva is on the panel, I won't get the hard question, but that didn't stop her. So, which question do you want me to start with?
I think the first one about, well, let's deal with the issue of non-for-profits acting as corporates.
Well, I actually don't see it like that, Eva.
I didn't think you would.
So
that's part of the problem.
What I see is we're an organisation which has 3,000 employees.
Yeah.
So we also run, a numbers of programs around Australia, and I don't think being responsible and looking at steps to empower our clients, to empower our staff, to look at some of the drivers of corporate responsibility is actually acting like a corporate. I don't see that paradigm. I think we've got to stop looking at, the non-for-profit, the for-profit, the government. I think it's time that we start to work together with all our talents and skills.
That is part of the problem. You are different organisations and you should be working according to different
Absolutely,
values.
but we have all different talents and different skills and things to add to the bigger picture. I think the 90s or the paradigm of the 60s where we're hoping that the government were going to solve the problem of the world is gone. I think that one of the problems today is that we've got to start working together. And it's not because an organisation like Mission Australia is using some of the corporate languages in terms of helping us to drive our corporate social responsibility that we're acting as a corporate.
But one of my other questions was, would you knock back a program that you thought was unethical? In other words, would you knock back government employment services because they're making you breach people unfairly?
Well, that's another question, and I agree with that. If we were put into a position where we have to compromise our values, we'll look at it.
Well, you are. You're in a position now.
Well, it's, you can't be so specific as that. You don't actually know whether we're breaching our clients or not. What we're looking at is some of the outcomes of the employment training program. We've put into job 50,000 people, long-term unemployed people this year. We've created 750 businesses. So if you talk to a client, Eva, which is what I'm interested in, if you go and talk to some of our clients and you hear the stories of how those guys...
But that is not answering the questions, that's ducking it, sorry.
Well,
that's you're doing PR.
We might duck and go to a question from the floor, and there's one coming here. Can I get your name and directed to which speaker?
Yes, can I please, can I brokerage this to some extent?
Thank you.
If you'll both allow me to proceed. Firstly, Eva, thank you. You've been an icon for myself and a lot of other women. Without your input and your questioning, we would not have the decent society we do. So thank you. Eric, I have to come to your rescue. Right? Eva, there's a few things that perhaps you may not understand, and that is that Mission Australia cannot be taken out of the context of the cultural changes that were implemented in Victoria. And there was a completely different path that was carved out. And Mission Australia was one of the few non-profits that actually picked up on it and actually understood that the state government was actually embarking on the most extraordinarily risky strategy. And the outcomes for the non-profit sector are really beneficial. Taking people that are categorised as disadvantaged, no-hopers, not worth anything.
Can I just say,
places-
I have no complaints about what they're doing to their clients, and I
No,
think,
no, no.
but I think
Perhaps
sort
if
of.
there's a question coming,
That, yeah,
'cause
I mean,
think we
you
do
know,
need to get to
I'm
some other people.
not actually attacking what Mission Australia does to its clients, and I don't read that I am.
They
It-
didn't sell out.
Well, all I'm saying is that there's aspects about the way they're doing this that raise questions, and I think there are questions that need to be asked.
Okay, can I ask a question then from the UK perspective to Lord Hastings? The difference between corporates and not-for-profits, is there a difference when it comes to reporting? Should there be a difference?
No, I don't think they should. And because although, I can see the point Eva's making, but I think it makes a fundamental misunderstanding of what the purpose of organisations...
Talking to you, Mike.
What the purpose of organisations is really all about. And organisations, whether in the not-for-profit or the public or the private or listed sphere, are intended to deliver services for clients, whatever the nature of them is. And so I think, therefore, you can have parallel reporting and measurement frameworks. But I'm questioning is whether or not the frameworks that currently exist deal with the most intangible and important aspects of leadership. But that is not to eliminate the fact that they are complementary service-oriented organisations.
Okay. Some questions, yep.
I guess one of the major things for any not-for-profit that's receiving government funds, handling public money, is that society demands that they are accountable, that they adhere to criteria. One particular client of mine, which is not-for-profit, meets and exceeds the ASX guidelines for listed companies in terms of corporate governance, and that's something they've taken on themselves, not that anyone else has put that on them.
Yep.
Now, and that organisation has to jump through enormous numbers of hoops in terms of criteria and accounting and reporting and auditing, service delivery, all of those things annually, and can have funding pulled from it at a week's notice. And in that kind of climate, they've got to have their act together. When you get to that issue, the lines between corporate and NGO are quite blurred, I think.
Blurred, okay.
In any case, I don't know if I'd want to have too sharp a distinction made between different types of organisation in terms of their ethical obligations. I think that it doesn't matter whether you are for-profit or not-for-profit. You should be concerned about the sources of income that you have, the purposes to which you apply it, the kind of judgment that you exercise in relation to the questions that come. And therefore, at that level, I think that if Mission Australia is being reflective, or an ethics centre or a university or a corporation on what their practice is, that's something you should aim for in all. The thing I just wanted to also pick up is Michael's comment about ethical leadership. I think you're absolutely right that these tools don't directly allow you to measure that. There are other tools by which you can do it, but perhaps not on a comparative basis. But what I think they do, if they're good, is that they give you an indication of a starting point, because you can look at the actual conduct and the degree of integration and the performance, and if you see a kind of a dirty, rotten scoundrel in terms of outcome, it's unlikely that they've got a brilliant ethical leadership. But if they're in a reasonable shape, it's at least an indicator that you say, well, there's something there, and you might want to interrogate it a bit further and triangulate with different things. And that's why I think their value is still there. But it does need something else as well.
Okay. President, question? Sorry, Anne-Marie.
I'd just like to ask the question, a number of corporates that I'm aware of have, I don't know if they've gone through a process with you or if they've gone through a process on their own in terms of measurement, and they've been so concerned because they keep falling behind and they're not actually improving each year, and therefore they're reluctant to actually go into an indices. Particularly, Simon, I'm wondering if you can comment on that.
Yes, that is a concern. But what's interesting is that there are quite a few companies who know that they are not going to be up in the stellar area in terms of performance, but they do it anyway. And they've got the courage to keep going. That's been true in the UK, it's been true here. And we've had a few CEOs and others who've been very honest about the fact that it's hard when they do it, but it's incredible information they can use. And this comes to issues of character then. If you're only prepared to do these things because you think you're going to score well, or if it costs you nothing to do it at all in terms of time, then it's such a low level of commitment, it's hardly worth you're being on the journey. But there are those companies that do it year in and year out who just make slow improvement. I think those are the ones we should celebrate, not the ones that come first or second.
Can I just...
More, but I just wonder, in terms of people wanting to participate, I mean, they don't have to go public either, do they? They can just do it on their own.
But what we're also doing is we're developing with the UK an alpha version of this, which is a bit like, I think, a bit similar to your thing, Eva, I'll have to look at that, which is a principles-based approach where you might agree in the first year to do that and you don't get it validated and you just see how you're going, then progress to a next stage where you might have validation but you don't do it published, and then you might move in a kind of a third year in a pipeline into a full process of engagement and where you do commit to report publicly. And the reason for doing it is I think that Michael was talking about this inclination in the states to see that on executive pay or something like that, that the community may very well demand a legislative response. Well, they will continue to do so until business is able to demonstrate in an objective and valid and validated measure that they are addressing these questions themselves. And for as long as they don't, then I think they leave open as the only alternative a community might seek is a legislative response.
Can I just sort of add just onto that, because I think that comes back to the question I was raising, which got drowned in my sort of comments about Mission Australia, which is that in many cases organisations don't necessarily do some sort of culture survey. They sort of tend to look for a lot of the benchmarks that come out of things like the Reputex and so on. And that means you might well have a culture that doesn't sort of support what you're doing, but you don't have the tools to actually work out why it isn't improving. And that's why I'm saying I think that if you get a culture survey, you know whether you are being trusted, whether you are seen as being trustworthy, whether the organisation, whether people raise issues. One of the really important points that's sort of out of some of the questions we ask is, are people prepared to raise a question? I mean, it comes back to what Lynette said earlier about HIH. Do they raise problems? What happens when they raise problems? Because unless you've got a problem-solving culture, unless you've got a culture which is open and reasonably transparent, you can sort of adhere to all sorts of formats. But in the end, nothing's going to change because people don't trust you. And I think that these are the sorts of things that if you're stuck, what you need to think about is, do we need to then go and start looking at other aspects of the thing? Because it goes back to the point I think that was made, that you were made right in the beginning. We tend to measure the measurable. We tend to sort of pick up the sort of fairly firm things that we can count. But often they are not very good indicators of what the problem is. They are indicators that you have a problem. And I think we've got to get into a more sophisticated set of ways of working out what it is that makes the organisation work well vis-a-vis what makes the organisation not improve. And they're different questions to the ones that you'll get out of a Reputex sample.
But these things are not, but they're not mutually exclusive either.
Yeah, they're not mutually exclusive, they're complementary, yes.
I just wanted to give a specific example, if I can, which is really along the lines of do you go up or down on the system. In the BBC's case, we, in the current responsibility index, have to report on the way in which our buildings deliver, how much electricity we use, the amount of waste that comes out the building, CO2 emissions and so on. Now, anybody who thinks about a media organisation realises that the primary environmental impact is not how much waste you throw out the back of the building, frankly, or the amount of electricity you use. It's whether or not a communications organisation helps people to understand the real issues about environmental change and climate change. And actually there's no way of measuring that because the current index model is so rigid that it only wants to count the CO2 emissions and the waste. It doesn't want to deal with the brain impact.
Because that's easy.
Yeah, exactly. And the brain impact stuff is the real stuff that actually matters.
Okay. We have a question at the back.
Let's change it.
Thanks. David Morrissey from RTD. Just following the debate around what I would characterise as the measuring of value, and I'd like to move it on, if I may, to the gaining of value from the measuring. Often in my work I'm finding a lot of overload where people are constrained to measure, whether they're using indices or other internal measures, and publish, and I'm getting increasing volume, as you doubtless are, of sustainability or social reports coming through the emails, and no one reads these things, we know this. So my question really is, in what systemic way are we able to gain value from the management profiles, management models that are in use today, and where lies the essential value this rush to measurement.
Can I just sort of put something in on that, because I think it relates back to, I mean, one of the things that I've said for years as a researcher, evaluator, various other things is, if you can't put the bulk of that stuff, say 90% of what you're measuring, into your KPIs and into your management information system, if it's always an add-on that you've got to supply to the affirmative action agency, whatever they're called these days, etc., 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 it's never going to become integral to your decision making. And I think one of the things we have to make decisions on is how do you actually integrate the bulk of what you want to do so it becomes part of your ordinary decision-making process, not just a ritual you have to go through because somebody's asked you for it. And then that leaves you about a 5 to 10% thing for looking at some specifics around climate surveys, attitude, you know, sort of...
Except that, just to build on that point, the point about the CRI is that it specifically is measuring and rewarding integration.
Right.
So it actually builds into its methodology that you don't bolt these things on. You've got to actually make it part of your day-to-day management. You might not agree on all of the particular issues that looking at it might be a bit too narrow, but it's got that basis. And where's the value, to answer the specific question? Well, the reason why we chose out of a kind of a smorgasbord of options this one is that it's built into the fact that it actually provides the kind of information that managers and boards need to improve their performance. So we get the benefit as a community from them doing better. That reduces cost, reduces risks, that's all the benefit there. But they're getting the benefit because it's something they can actually do something with.
Okay.
An embedded assumption there that this information is being used for decision making. Do we have any evidence that this is the
Yes,
case?
yes.
Well, you oughtn't to be collecting it if it hasn't got some sort of relationship to decision making.
You can talk to companies, a number of them in Australia that do this, that use it specifically to change the way they do things and make decisions.
Well, that's the closing of the loop that I'm looking for.
Yeah, well, that's what it's doing.
Okay, I do have a question here.
The legislating for behaviour is a phenomenon that the Americans have taken to the nth level with Sarbanes-Oxley. They even have a requirement for an ethics officer in the sentencing guideline. Do any of the panel really believe that legislating actually changes values and behaviours?
No, but it sometimes makes people aware of the fact that that there's some necessity for being there. But I mean, I think the problem is that if you legislate for something, people will go through it. And I mean, you can find this in a lot of the stuff. I mean, part of what I've been thinking about this stuff comes from my involvement for many years in sort of feminist change. We've got lots of legislative processes in there about how you're supposed to act in certain ways. It doesn't change the culture of most large organisations in terms of the fact that they still retain a lot of the old cultural stuff. But legislation sometimes is useful to kick something off. But it should always be a last resort type thing that actually is there to sort of police the people that won't conform, because unless you do it willingly without that, it's not going to work.
I've got to go. I'm sorry, I have to leave at 3:30 to catch a plane, but I'll make one sort of closing comment, and it's on that. There is some evidence that legislation does change attitudes. For example, random breath testing and seatbelts. The changes in the law preceded the change in actual attitude. So that's just a kind of empirical issue. But that said, I'm and my organisation are cautious about regulation and surveillance of the kind that's been applied in the United States, and it's for this reason. It does kind of ethical damage to society if you put all of your eggs in this basket, and it reduces our sinews. And in fact, you should note in America, when they talk about ethics officers, they don't mean people like me. They're talking about compliance officers. That's what the word means. But this is the proposition that some people operate on. They think that it might be possible, if only we could afford it, to legislate and to surveil to the extent that no one can choose to do anything wrong. The problem with that is that if you were successful, and you can't be, but if you were, then you would create the situation in which no one can choose to do what is right. You don't choose. It's a world entirely compliant. And that is where we have been heading, and it's a risk. And yet, if you talk to a lot of corporates, they will tell you now that the room for ethics has been completely squeezed out of their organisations by the space taken by compliance.
And Simon, I'll thank you for your time, but I will finish with one last question just for the other panel if you need to go.
Just following on from that, in terms of there's a balance, it seems very much driven from the corporate rather than the social in with it. What role do you see things like, pity Simon's gone, but some of the other panels to ask that why it all very much seems very voluntary, all this measurement, rather than any other assessments coming from the social and people being able to make, say, brand choices or market choices in terms of the measurement. And also related to that is that by nature, values are a changing things and social things are a changing thing. What role or how is measurement sort of adapting to the fact that over time values change as well?
I think we're talking mainly, if you're talking about sort of, I mean, there's some interesting questions around sort of what's an ethical way of doing it. And I think there's some ethical processes which gets you out of it. That's why I don't like codes of ethics or sort of codes of values, because you then get stuck with the, with the sets of statements that somebody made up a long time ago and somebody's pinned on the back of the door and nobody reads. But if you're looking at an ethical culture and an ethical process, it will adapt as it goes to some degree to when this changes. And it does allow you then to actually discuss what the right thing to do is. And I mean, the way I shorthand it is that people like, working in organisations where what they see as doing the right thing matches the way we do things around here. It gives you a sense that, the two things actually work together, and then then there isn't a tension about it. But I don't think anybody's talking about trying to set down very firm things, except, there are, a firm set of statements about what you should and shouldn't do. It's more about trying to create an ethos of people, and that goes back to some of the questions around legislation, but an ethos where organisations tend to be committed to doing the right thing, to thinking through what they're doing, working out who suffers, working out who benefits, and trying to make decisions on that sort of basis. So it's trying to incorporate that in. Just on the question of sort of the corporate values, I mean, one of the questions which we at some stage need to address, and I think there's something going on in Canberra that was actually looking at this, is whether the Corporations Act needs to be rewritten so that shareholders come much lower down the value scale in the same way that they do in many countries such as Germany and Japan. It's only really the Anglophone countries that actually put the shareholders as high as they do, and that's a really interesting question that goes really to the core of what's a corporation there for. I don't quite agree with Simon. I think there are differences if you are there to serve the community as your primary aim rather than you're there to actually make money for shareholders. I think there are some differences that do emerge, even though there are many things in common at the organisation.